The Vatican has declared that it will accept gays into its priesthood, and this is not surprising at all. Why do I say this? Well, because the Vatican for a very, very long time has been riddled with homosexuals. The Roman Catholic priesthood has been riddled with homosexuals. It's practically a gay club, and so the Vatican really is a gay church. And the Vatican is now saying, listen, we are now going to officially accept gays into the priesthood. Even though our priesthood has been riddled with gays for a long time, we are now going to make it official policy. And so the Vatican is not even trying to hide it. They are simply saying, we're going to accept gays out in the open. We're going to do it right there in plain sight. They are making it official policy. And so this is not surprising at all. Why do I say this? Well, because the Vatican, if you look at its record, has been a part of Sodom for a very long time. For decades, the Vatican has been covering up for predator priests, priests who have preyed on children, priests who have preyed on young men. The Vatican will cover up for these evildoers, for these deviants. The Vatican not too long ago declared that priests can give a blessing to two men who are married. A number of years ago, Pope Francis declared his support for same-sex civil unions. How much more evidence do you acolytes of the Vatican need to be convinced that the Vatican is a gay church? It's a gay church. It is an ecclesiastical institution of Sodom. But then you have the Roman Catholics who will come out and they will try to argue for the Vatican because they believe that the Vatican was founded by Jesus Christ, therefore it's infallible, therefore God can never nor will ever cut off the Roman Church. So no matter how evil the Roman Catholic Church is, they will simply try to argue for it. They will try to defend the church, and they will try to use these caveats to defend whatever evil the church does. So for example, when the Roman Catholic Church declared that priests can give a blessing to two men who are married, the Roman Catholic acolytes came out and they said, well, yeah, but it's not the same blessing that you would give to a married husband and wife. But it's still a blessing to Sodom. In Christianity, there are no caveats for evil. There are no loopholes. The problem is that too many Roman Catholics are Talmudic. They are always looking for loopholes to justify whatever evil they are pushing, to justify whatever evil they are accepting and embracing. And so if the Vatican says priests can give a blessing to a same-sex union, the Vatican will also say, but it's not the same blessing that you would give to a husband and wife, but it's still a blessing to Sodom. And once you allow blessings to Sodom, you have made it very clear to everyone that you are a part of Sodom. That's it. It's very, very simple. So whatever evil the Vatican does will not surprise me at all, given its criminal record. So let's look at an article that was published by the New York Times today. The New York Times came out with an article today reporting on how the Vatican has made it official that it will accept gays into the seminary, and therefore it will accept gays into the priesthood. So I'm going to read to you guys some excerpts from this article, and it says, the Vatican has approved new guidelines for Italy that say that an applicant for the seminary cannot be rejected simply because he is gay, as long as he remains celibate. As long as he remains celibate, it doesn't matter if he's gay. It don't matter if he's homosexual, because what matters right now is human dignity. Human dignity is what matters. And this article goes on to say that the guidelines say that seminary directors should consider homosexual orientation as only one aspect of a candidate's personality. And I really, really despise this way of arguing. It's so weaselly. Instead of just saying, listen, we're pro-Sodom, they have to make these little conditions. They have to make it out to be that they're not really wholly embracing Sodom when they really are. And so, for example, they say here, well, being homosexual is not one aspect of who they are, so it's not really that much of a big deal, blah, 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 blah. Now, here's the thing. The rule was, back in the day, really before this point, the rule was that homosexuals were not allowed to be were not allowed entry into the seminary and not allowed entry into the priesthood. So the Vatican is simply throwing that rule out the window because, well, they never really enforced it, and the Roman Catholic priesthood is riddled with homosexuals anyway. So the Vatican is saying, yeah, we're just going to now accept these people. We're now going to accept these citizens of Sodom out in the open into our seminary and in turn into our priesthood. If you look at the first letter that was written, the first epistle that was written to the Roman Catholic Church, who wrote it? You're going to say, well, it was Pope so-and-so and Pope this or Saint this. It was Saint Paul. Saint Paul, the one who had an encounter with Christ while he was on the road to Damascus. Saint Paul wrote his letter, his epistle to the Romans. That is, to the Roman Church. And if you look at that epistle, what does Saint Paul say? St. Paul, in his letter to the Roman Catholic Church, warns the Roman Church about what? Homosexuality. He warns them about homosexuality right there in the first chapter of the epistle. And he talks about the history of paganism. And he talks about how humanity began to worship the creation and not the creator. And he talks about how men began to lust after one another. And what does St. Paul say about these men? He says, and God gave them up. So homosexuals are given up by God. So how can you accept people into the priesthood of God when these very people have been literally given up by God? Homosexuals have been given up by God. So how can they be allowed entry into the priesthood of God? If you're allowing people who have been given up by God into the priesthood of God, or into a priesthood that's supposed to be of God, well, then it's no longer a priesthood of God. It's a priesthood of Sodom. It's a priesthood of Satan. It's an antichrist priesthood. So the priesthood of the Vatican is now really a priesthood of the religion of Sodom. It's a part of the church of Sodom. St. Paul doesn't say in his epistle, well, yes, you had men who were lusting after each other, but that was only one aspect of their personality. And so, yeah, it was okay for them to become priests. No. He says, and God gave them up. How can you allow people who have been given up by God into the priesthood? Unless, of course, your priesthood is not of God. And it's really of Sodom, it's really of the Antichrist. And so the article goes on to say that the Catholic Church has struggled for years with the contradiction that the priesthood has long been a refuge for gay men, while church teaching rejects same-sex relations. So you don't even have to do serious research to find out that the Vatican priesthood is riddled with homosexuals. The New York Times article is already saying it right here. For years, it has been riddled with homosexuals. So the Vatican is simply saying, listen, we know that it's against the rules to allow gays into the priesthood, but we're just going to throw that rule out the window, and we're going to accept these sodomites out in the open in plain sight because they don't really give a damn. They don't give a damn because they've come to the point where, hey, we're this super rich institution. There are tons of people who still think that we are an institution of God and they follow everything that we say, or they will simply just naively follow us. So they just see us as stupid sheeple. They don't give a damn, these people. But the reality is that they are a gay church, and a lot more people are seeing it. And that's why you have a lot of people going through a massive exodus out of the Vatican, and they are going into the Eastern Orthodox Church. So here is a quote from this pro-Sodom priest by the name of James Martin. James Martin, all right, this guy's in New York, and he says here, and the article quotes him, this is the first time I've seen in a Vatican-approved document the suggestion that discernment about whether a gay man may enter the seminary cannot be determined simply by his sexual orientation. My reading of this, and it is only my reading, is that if a gay man is able to lead an emotionally healthy, chaste, and celibate life, he may be considered for admission into the seminary. And this guy loves this because James Martin is pro-Sodom. He is a pro-Sodom priest. He is a pro-Sodom activist. For a very long time, this guy has been pushing the Sodomite religion in the Catholic Church. And so he loves this. He absolutely loves this. So The Catholic Church works in incremental steps. It doesn't work in a way where it just pushes everything all at once. It works in little tiny movements. It's like the analogy of the railway bridge. So if you want to make a new railway bridge, you don't just demolish the bridge because that will disrupt the flow of traffic. What you do is you simply take little parts out of the bridge and then you replace those little parts. And you do this little by little, step by step. So the bridge is still intact, but you are slowly replacing its pieces. And the trains are allowed to ride upon the bridge, and the passengers on these trains will not even notice. They're going to be reading their newspapers, or they're going to be reading their phones, looking at their phones, and they're just going to be enjoying their ride. And before they know it, boom, there's a new railway bridge. And they won't even notice that there's a new railway bridge until the railway bridge has been completely redone. And then they'll notice it. But before that, they will not notice it because the railway bridge has been getting changed, has been getting rebuilt little by little, piece by piece, part by part. And this is how the Vatican works. This is how the Vatican functions. It doesn't just say, oh yes, embrace Sodom. It says, well, we can give a blessing to two men who are married, but it won't be a blessing that you would give to an actual husband and wife. No. Oh yes, let's support same-sex civil unions. But we're not saying that we support gay marriage in the church, but we're simply saying that we support secular same-sex civil unions. And so people will hear that sort of argumentation and they will fall for it. Because why? Why is that? Because Catholics want to believe so desperately that their church is still a part of God's church. They still desperately want to believe that. Now, they will see all of the evils. They will see the cover-ups. They will see how for so many decades the Vatican has been covering up for sexual predator priests. They'll see all of these graphic details, all of this dark reality, and they know in their hearts this is an evil institution, but they so desperately want to grip onto the institution. They so desperately want the institution to remain intact. They so desperately want to hold on to this narrative that, well, because the Roman Catholic Church was founded by God, therefore it can never be cut off. But what does St. Paul say in his letter to the Romans? He says, do not be arrogant and do not think that God will not cut you off. For if God cut off the original branches, meaning the Jewish temple, God will also cut you off. And so you have all these Roman Catholics saying God will never cut off the Roman Church. And yet in St. Paul's letter to the Roman Church, he says, do not be arrogant and think that God will not cut you off. And so these Catholics, with their wishful thinking, with their cope, go directly against what St. Paul wrote in the very first epistle to the Roman Catholic Church. And the problem is that Catholics, they not only just follow the Pope of Rome, they also follow the Cope of Rome, because they are always trying to cope with the dark reality of how evil their institution is. So they're constantly coping, constantly coming up with arguments, constantly going onto YouTube and watching their favorite Roman Catholic apologists to get the arguments, so that when they are confronted with the reality of the evils of their church, they can now defend their church. They can now argue, and they'll use sophistry. They'll say, well, yes, it's true that the Roman Catholic Church is now officially saying that gays can enter the seminary, which means that they can enter the priesthood also. But it also says that as long as they're celibate, they can now be given access into the seminary. But they always make these sorts of arguments. They always sit there and say, well, yeah, as long as they're celibate, this and that. But God gave them up. St. Paul says it right there, that when men began to lust after each other, God gave them up. So it doesn't matter if they're celibate or not. In fact, St. Paul doesn't say, well, they lusted after each other, but they were celibate. No. St. Paul says they lusted after one another, and God gave them up. So once you accept Sodom in any way, once you accept this idea that, well, sodomites can enter the seminary and enter the priesthood, as long as they're celibate, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because you are still accepting Sodom. You are still embracing men who God has given up into the priesthood. Do you see the dark reality of this? But they will always have these caveats to try to justify whatever it is that they're doing. They will always have these caveats. Well, yes, the church does say that you can give a blessing to two men who are married, but it's not a blessing that you would give to a husband and wife. It's still a blessing to Sodom. In Christianity, there are no caveats for evil. The article goes on to say, the thorniness of the issue became clear last year when reports emerged that Pope Francis had used an anti-gay slur when responding to Italian bishops at a conference in May about admitting gay men into seminaries. In his remarks, Francis said that there was already too much gayness in the Catholic seminary. So the Roman Catholics can come out and they can argue that their priesthood is not riddled with sodomites, but your own Pope has admitted that the Catholic priesthood is riddled with sodomites. And guess what? When Pope Francis said this, he apologized. He had to issue an apology. Why did Pope Francis have to issue an apology? Why? Why does he have to issue an apology for making an objection that was correct? His objection was that there's too many sodomites in the Roman Catholic priesthood. That is a correct objection. And finally, you see Pope Francis saying something good. And what happens? He has to apologize. Why? Why would he have to apologize for making such an observation? Oh, because the Vatican is a gay church. That's the bottom line. The Vatican is a gay church. When you compile all of the facts, decades of covering up for homosexual predator priests, Pope Francis expressing his support for same-sex civil unions, the Vatican coming out and declaring that a blessing may be given to two men who are married, what more evidence do you need that the Vatican is a church of Sodom and not a church of God? Oh, and Pope Francis saying, hey, there are too many sodomites in the Roman Catholic priesthood. Oh, I'm sorry for saying that. Oh, I'm so sorry. Why would he have to apologize? Because it's a gay church. That's the reason. The whole thing is controlled by Sodom. He has met often, so Pope Francis has met often with gay rights activists, and in 2023, he decided to allow priests to bless same-sex couples. Like I said, it's a gay church. Father Martin, who met with Francis after the episodes last year, later shared a post on social media that said, with his permission to share this, the Holy Father said he has known many good, holy, and celibate seminarians and priests with homosexual tendencies. So again, you're embracing Sodom. Yet Francis has repeatedly expressed concern that gay candidates for priesthood can end up having relationships and living what he described as double lives. And that's exactly what goes on in the Vatican. In fact, it gets worse than that. You have homosexual priests who will prey on young men, who will prey on young Catholic men. And then when they get confronted, you know what happens? The Vatican protects them. Or when they get reported on, the Vatican protects them. And I've seen this myself, and I have recounted this story so many times, but I'm going to say the story again. My first year in the Roman Catholic Church, I meet this priest, Father Robert L. Kinsel. And it turns out that Father Robert L. Kinsel is a sexual predator who tried to cover up for a pedophile priest who was a convicted pedophile who was sentenced to prison for the crime of pedophilia. And that priest's name was Father Robert Hrdlicka. Hrdlicka was found guilty of pedophilia, of molesting children. And instead of Father Kinsel coming out and saying, this guy deserves to be put behind bars, he really deserves more than that. He deserves the death penalty. Let's be real here. But instead of saying, let the law be imposed, and instead of working with law enforcement, what does Kinsel do? Kinsel goes to the police and he begs the police, oh, please don't put Robert Hrdlicka in prison. Don't do this. Don't put him in jail. Don't put him behind bars. Don't impose the law. Just send him to a Catholic rehabilitation center. He needs prayer. Sure, he molested children, but he needs prayer and he needs Catholic guidance. That's the Catholic Church. And Robert L. Kinsel was teaching people that homosexuality was not a sin. As long as homosexuals stayed in a monogamous relationship, homosexuality was kosher. This is what this guy was teaching. And I reported him to the Diocese of Austin. And the Diocese of Austin had a meeting with me, and I gave them all of this evidence to prove what I was saying. And we had about a 2.5 hour long meeting, and they said, there's nothing we can do. They said, there's nothing we can do about it. And the guy asked me, well, what do you want us to do about it? And I said, well, how about you excommunicate him? And he rolled his eyes at me. And he says, well, we can't do that because we only excommunicate people for doing a great scandal against people's souls. And what the hell is this? So in other words, teaching homosexuality is not a threat to people's souls. This is the Vatican. This is the Roman Catholic Church. Then in my second year as a Roman Catholic, in 2014, I met a priest by the name of Monsignor Michael Yarbrough. And him and I were talking, and he said, well, how about we meet in private? And we'll talk. We'll talk about spiritual matters. Okay. I Googled this guy and I find a story. I find a report that recounted how Monsignor Michael Yarbrough invited a young man to his office to talk. And when the young man entered his office, he proceeded to sexually assault this young man. He groped him, he grabbed his head, and he kissed this young man on the lips. It was like something out of Silence of the Lambs. And so I told myself, I'm going to confront this bastard to make sure that he never does this sort of thing again. And I knew that he wanted to prey on me. And so I gave him a call and I said, yeah, let's meet. And he said, well, let's meet in my office. And I said, well, let's meet in a cafe. He said, well, I much prefer that we meet in my office. And I remember the hair on my arms stood up because I knew exactly what he was doing. He was preying on me. I was dealing with a demon. And I said, no, it's closer to where I work. And I made this whole thing up that it's close to my job and all this stuff. So it'll be much easier for me to go to the cafe. And he said, okay, fine. So we went to the cafe. I had my dad come. My dad sat in the table adjacent to ours, acted like he wasn't. My dad acted like he wasn't with me at all. My dad had this little GoPro camera on his wrist. And we wrapped it around with this cloth to make it look like it was a wristwatch, and it was really recording the whole conversation the entire time. And I confronted him and I said, does the name Hector Escalante ring a bell? Hector Escalante was the name of the young man that he sexually assaulted. And he got up and he fled, and he ran away and all this stuff, and I wasn't done with him. About a week or so later, I went to his church in the middle of Sunday Mass. And I had a camera in my hand, and I filmed him as he was giving communion. Oh, yeah. And the ushers came over, and they said, who are... And he looked at me. I remember he was giving the communion out, and he looked at me, and his face became as red as a tomato. And the ushers came out, and they all confronted me. They said, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? And I said, I'm just filming Mass. This is a very sacred time for us right now. Why are you filming? Now, I've seen people film Masses. I've seen it. I have seen many a time people taking photos during Mass. No one ever did anything to them. And the reason why they were so aggressive with me is because they knew why I was there. And so they kept saying, you got to get out, you got to get out, you got to get out. And I was arguing with them, and I said, do you know that this guy sexually assaulted a young man? And do you know what they told me? They said, we don't believe that. And I said, well, the San Antonio Express reported it. San Antonio Express is the local newspaper in the city of San Antonio. And I said, the San Antonio Express reported it. And this one usher said, I don't care who reported. He's our Monsignor. And he said, I don't believe that. He basically said, oh, that's fake news and blah, blah, blah. He didn't believe it. And this is Roman Catholics. When you tell them the reality, when you give them the dark details of their church, they will dismiss. They will dismiss everything that you say. They don't give a damn. And that's why they're evil. Anyone who dismisses facts because they expose the evils of their institution or the evils of their country is evil. It's like when you go to Zionists and you say, yeah, look, here's a story, here is a newspaper report that documents how Israeli soldiers are shooting civilians for sport in Gaza. And they'll say, I don't believe that. That's fake news. That's all bullshit. I refuse to believe it. Those people are evil. They are dismissing the reality of evil. They're just shutting their eyes because they're so biased for whatever it is that they believe in. They're so biased for whatever country or institution that they are so gung-ho about. And it's just evil. It's sick, it's twisted, and it's evil. If you go to these Roman Catholics and say, listen, this priest is a sexual predator, he sexually assaulted a young man, and they say, I don't give a damn, those people are evil. Because they refuse to get up and expose the priest. They refuse to confront the priest. And if you refuse to confront your priest, even though you have been given the facts of how evil the priest is, you are evil. Plain and simple. And I don't need to give you guys a detailed explanation as to why that is. The Vatican is an evil institution. And I remember doing a video showing my confrontation of Monsignor Michael Yarbrough, and I showed the video of me confronting him, and then in the same video I show the video of him giving mass, and in the same video you can see the ushers confronting me. And I remember speaking to the producer of Church Militant, which was once ran by Mr. Michael Voris. And I said, are you guys interested in a video of me confronting a homosexual predator priest? And the producer said, yeah, we'd love to see it. Send it over. And at this point, I had done about 2 or at most 3 interviews with Church Militant. So they knew who I was. I sent them the video, and I never got a response back. Well, I didn't really get a response back. And that was unusual because when I would write the producer of Church Militant in the past, I would always get a pretty quick reply. And so I waited and waited, and a week went by and there was no reply. And I thought, well, this is unusual. So I wrote the producer and I said, hey, is something wrong? And he said, yeah, we had a meeting about showing your video on Church Militant, and everyone agreed to show your video except for one guy. Everyone except for one guy agreed to show your video on Church Militant. And he didn't give me the name of this one guy, but I'm going to assume that it was Michael Voris. And he said the reason why this person objected to showing your video is because you confronted the priest during Mass. And I said, excuse me, what do you call Jesus Christ whipping the merchants in the temple? And it's amazing because Michael Voris was one of the ones who inspired me to do that sort of activism work. Because I remember when I first became Catholic, Michael Voris said, if you are Catholic, you have to be willing to be as Christ when he took out a whip and drove the merchants out of his Father's house. And he said, are you willing to be like Christ? Are you willing to take out the whip and drive out the merchants? And I heard that and I said, that makes perfect sense. If you are a Catholic, you have to have that same zeal that Christ had. And remember, if you read the Gospel of John, it says, after Christ drove the merchants out, that the disciples were reminded of that verse, and I have zeal for my Father's house. And Christ had zeal for his Father's house. And so I was inspired by what Voris said. And when it came down to it, Voris did not want to support me. In fact, he essentially condemned me for confronting people who were worse than the merchants that Christ drove out. The merchants were bad, don't get me wrong. But this guy is a sexual predator. He's dead now. This guy was a sexual predator who was sexually preying on young men. These are people who have converted the house of God into the house of Sodom. And I confronted this guy, and I confronted his ushers. And instead of Michael Voris saying, yeah, this is the Catholic militant way, he didn't want to support me. In fact, he condemned me. Why? Because I confronted the priest during Mass, but Jesus confronted the merchants and drove the merchants out in the temple during the Passover, which was the holiest holiday for the Jews. But none of that mattered. I gave that argument to the producer. He didn't give a damn. But this is the reality. This is the Vatican. It's a gay church. It is. It is a gay church. And I don't know what more you need to be convinced of that. You just look at the whole record. It's quite obvious. It's a gay church. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.